All right, well then, why don't I get us launched? Bienvenidos, welcome one and all to the Department of Sociology and Anthropology's book event for the recent publications of Ismael Garcia Colon and Jeffrey Bussolini. My name is Don Selby. I'll act as moderator for this event. Let me start by extending the department's appreciation to the Office of the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences, especially Donna Garambone, the Office of Student Light, Jeremiah Jerkowitz in particular, Gail Baghdadi-Williams, all for the support of this event. So the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, a joint major that offers a general soc-anth concentration or a concentration in critical criminology and social justice, has 13 faculty, full-time faculty at present, who collectively have published 7 books in just the last 5 years. These include many by Jean Halley, including the forthcoming The Roads to Hillbrow, Life in South Africa's Community of Migrants, coming in June, Grace Cho's award-winning Tastes Like War, my own Human Rights in Thailand, beautifully displayed behind me, and Özlem Gunar's Turkish National Identity and Its Outsiders, back in 2017. Later this semester, we'll hold an event focused on recent publications by Saglar Bugdaeva, Philippe Marias, and Tom Volsho. Today, though, we're recognizing 2 publications that have come out during the pandemic, providing a much needed occasion for celebration. Ismael Garcia Colon's Colonial Migrants at the Heart of Empire came out in 2020, and later won the Puerto Rican Studies Association's Frank Bonilla Book Award. Last year saw the publication of Jeffrey Bussolini's translation of Vincent Desprez' The Dance of the Arabian Babbler, a path-breaking contribution to ethological theory. Before I turn things over to Ismael and Jeffrey, a word about organization. Each will talk about his book for around 15 minutes, after which we'll have time for a Q&A. Please feel free to post questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand. Professor Mukherjee, Chair of Sociology and Anthropology, will pass on questions from the chat to me, and I will call on live questioners in the order in which I see hands raised. Also, please, if you haven't already done it, please mute your mics so that we don't get background noise while Ismael and Jeffrey are presenting. When it comes to questions, please keep them concise, and of course, to make sure they're questions so that we can get as many as possible. With that said, let me turn the floor over to Ismael Garcia Colon.
Thank you, Don, for the introduction. Let me share my screen with a PowerPoint presentation for the book. Like Don was saying, the title of my book is Colonial Migrants at the Heart of Empire, Puerto Rican Workers on U.S. Farms. The experience of Puerto Ricans in farm labor challenges our understanding of citizenship in relation to immigration policies. Since 1898, the U.S. invasion of Puerto Rico has complicated North American perceptions of Puerto Ricans. Even after 1917, when the United States granted citizenship to the inhabitants of Puerto Rico, mainstream US society has always suspected them of being illegal aliens, unquote, within quotes, right? Their designation as colonial subjects, mixed racial backgrounds, Latin American culture, and Spanish speaking marked them as different in a nation state where being a white Anglo-Saxon embodied the dominant notion of citizenship. Employment-related cases in farm labor illustrate the complexities of Puerto Rican workers. in this industry. Farmers frequently fire and reject job applications of Puerto Rican farm workers in favor of guest workers in violation of the regulations of the H-2A visa program. The H-2A program, and before 1986, the H-2 program, required that employers offer jobs to domestic workers before applying for guest worker visas. And this is under the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. Many agricultural employers view Puerto Rican as a problem because of their US citizenship. Basically, they have rights. Many this type of incidents where employers fire Puerto Ricans have become more common as the current economic crisis in Puerto Rico impels migration to US farms. And my book then is about this long history of Puerto Rican workers in US farm labor. Few in number compared to guest workers and undocumented workers, Puerto Rican migrant farm workers nevertheless constituted more than 60,000 farm workers per year at the peak of their migration during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Contract Puerto Rican farm labor migration concentrated on the northeast of the United States. Departing from historical anthropology, I conducted archival research and ethnographic research in order to understand over time the formation of Puerto Rican workers. I argued that US guest worker programs, immigration and deportation policies, colonialism, and citizenship shaped the flows of Puerto Rican farm labor migration. US colonialism is one of the most important forces that foster Puerto Rican migration. When I talk about colonialism, I'm referring to Eric Wolf's concept of structural power. Specific US colonial policies, legal decisions, and action transform migrants' fields of action by incorporating Puerto Ricans into the US labor market. Colonialism then, in my view, is not in terms of top-down process, but in terms of the dynamic field of power relations that shape how officials from the government of Puerto Rico, states and federal agencies intervene in this migration and how workers maneuvered to migrate. My book also departs from the work of Natalie Potts and Nicolas de Genova. They argued that a deportation regime creates subjectivities of naturalized, immigrant, foreign, and illegal denizens, and in the case of Puerto Rican, colonial migrants. The deportability status of a large part of farm workers rendered domestic workers, including Puerto Ricans, as undesirable for agriculture. This book is also about the agency of Puerto Rican migrants. Like Jose Cruz argues, Puerto Ricans were the ones that made the decisions to leave and took seriously the promises of US citizenship. The first part of the book is about the administrative and legal processes and outcomes that induced attempts to manage labor migration. And I have investigated Puerto Rican farm labor migration through the Puerto Rico Farm Labor Program. Inspired by the Bracero program, the Puerto Rico Farm Labor Program placed workers in more than 400 farm jobs in the United States, indirectly fostering the migration of thousands of non-contract workers and the emergence of many state-sized Puerto Rican communities. The government of Puerto Rico in 1947 created the Bureau of Employment and Migration and its migration division under the Puerto Rico Department of Labor that administered this Puerto Rico Farm Labor Program. Like I mentioned, it was influenced by guest worker programs, especially the Mexican, British, West Indian programs. And the government of Puerto Rico had offices in Puerto Rico, but also in the United States, in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Camden, Hartford, Chicago, and Cleveland, that oversaw this migration. The government of Puerto Rico issued publications to inform farmers on how to hire Puerto Rican workers. Issue also this bilingual contracts with really timely letters that most of the workers anyway couldn't read because they were illiterate. And of course, you're not going to be able to read it now. And imagine the workers is really tiny letters. The government of Puerto Rico at the beginning of this program also leased airplanes to carry out this migration from Puerto Rico. And imagine those cargo planes modified for passengers with these chairs, fragile chairs. And this is a group of migrants arriving in Buffalo, New York. The government of Puerto Rico also issued this kind of pamphlets to inform other U.S. citizens that Puerto Ricans were U.S. citizens, because the problem was that many people consider, and this problem is to the present time, that they consider Puerto Ricans as foreigners in U.S. territory, but like I mentioned before, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. And also the government of Puerto Rico issue IDs. So government agencies in the mainland United States will know that these workers were U.S. citizens from Puerto Rico. And this is what I found, right? The Naturalization Act of 1940 defined Puerto Ricans as native-born citizens. Before that, before 1940, in 1917, when Puerto Ricans were granted citizenship, it was a naturalized citizenship. And when Puerto Rico became part of the United States in 1898, Puerto Ricans became nationals of the United States. As nationals, Puerto Rican migrated to the periphery of U.S. empire, right, to the territories of the United States, like Hawaii, Cuba at that time. Although Mexico and Ecuador weren't, there were American companies that were in those countries hire Puerto Rican workers, and the canal zone in Panama that was under the control of the United States. And there were small numbers going to New York City, but there was not a massive migration to the continental United States. When Puerto Ricans become US citizens, but naturalized citizens, most of the migration went to the south of the United States in places basically that had factories and industries related to the war efforts during the First World War. By the 1940s, there was a dramatic change when then Puerto Ricans began to be considered citizens by birth. And this is when this massive migration from Puerto Rico to the United States happened. Between 1940 to the 1960s, a quarter of the Puerto Rican population migrated to the continental United States. And this is when the Puerto Rican Farm Labor Program happened. The Puerto Rican migrant program was officialized when the government of Puerto Rico and the United States included Puerto Ricans in the H-2A program, in the H-2 program at that time, where they had to send all the job orders requesting domestic workers also to Puerto Rico and not only to the states of the United States. And the Puerto Rican program lasted until the 1990s. And there was always this problem of promoting Puerto Rican farm labor because of this notion that Puerto Ricans were foreigners in the eyes of other US citizens. And even the US Senator Dennis Chavez from New Mexico had to intervene in favor of Puerto Rican workers during the 1940s and to 1950s to be included in migrant programs in the United States. But even with that, farmers like in the Shea Tobacco in the Connecticut River Valley, they prefer workers that could be deported, and Puerto Ricans could not be deported because they were US citizens. So when the Bracero programs end in 1964, 1965, is when this contract labor migration exploded, right? At the peak of this migration is in the late 1960s. By the 1970s, under the Ford administration, Nixon and Ford administrations, then there's another return to guest workers, and this preference for Puerto Rican workers as domestic workers then is undermined by the federal government. This photo is of labor camp, the main labor camp in southern New Jersey that house Puerto Rican workers. And the second part of my book then it talks about the experiences of the workers in this program, their migration, and the events that happens surrounding the Puerto Rico Farm Labor Program. These are photos that the government of Puerto Rico took of the living conditions of workers in these labor camps. These are the barracks. These are, just to compare, a barrack from the 1948, and this is from 2013. And these are officials of the government of Puerto Rico coming to oversee this migration to the fields in the United States. So workers actually complain against the authorities and the government of Puerto Rico and other workers. And in this case, this is a letter that wrote farm workers complaining about the treatment that Puerto Ricans suffer at the hand of farmers. And he argues, he says, quote, "It should not be like this because we are as much citizens as those born here." Well, they were born here in American territory and we under the American flag. There are many abuses committed against Puerto Rican citizens in the camps. There are so many that one of these days will have to protest, unquote. And this is basically, some of the reactions, and that Puerto Ricans rebel, right, against the mistreatment of farmers and also the rural populations in the United States. And they staged strikes. By the 1970s, in the apple industry, they didn't want Puerto Rican workers, farmers, and they went to the courts effectively limiting the hiring of Puerto Rican workers. There were attempts to unionize them, but unfortunately, by the late 1980s and 1990s, there were few Puerto Ricans migrating to the farms, and the government of Puerto Rico decided to eliminate the program. So to conclude, the migration of Puerto Ricans to the United States is a migration of colonial subjects. The United States still holds colonies under their rule. US immigration policies and guest workers programs shape this migration. It's not the US immigration policies and deportation policies shape also the lives of US citizens like Puerto Ricans. And that my study is more about colonialism rather than transnationalism, and we should pay more attention to colonialism. And that to do this, we need a comparative task force, a task to look at race, immigration, and citizenship, and the intersection of these categories in U.S. farm labor. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Yeah. Bravo. So let's now turn it over to Jeffrey Bussolini.
Thank you very much for that, Ismael, and thank you, Don and Anya, for putting this together, and for everyone who's listening. I very much appreciate your time and the ability to talk about this. I apologize that I don't have a PowerPoint like Ismael, and I also don't have pictures, which I perhaps should have gotten some pictures of the birds, the Arabian babblers, who are the subject of this book. But if you're interested, you can easily look them up. Arabian babblers, they're fascinating birds. I'll talk some about some of their behaviors and traits that are highlighted in this book. But let me just say that there's a reason why this book and other research has been made about these particular birds, because their behavior and their social activities are really something, are really noteworthy. By way of situating this book and how I got involved in the project of translating this book in the first place, I'll say that in the mid-1990s, I started to study cat behavior and feline-human interactions. And I started to use social science methods, especially ethnographic approaches from sociology and anthropology, to study those social interactions between cats and those social interactions that would take place in a larger sense between cats and humans. There were a very small group of people who agreed at the time that those methods could be used for studying these kind of beings, but it was a productive point of departure. I should say that in the meantime, this book came out in the mid-90s in French. The translation in English just came out, but it came out in the mid-90s in French. In the meantime, since that time when I first started looking at cats and Vincent was studying babblers along with Amos Zahavi in Israel, quite a bit has changed, because now a number of the disciplines that had been kind of hostile to studying animals or treating animals as interlocutors or subjects on par with humans have become much less hostile to that, or even welcoming to that. So even though it seemed obvious to me and some others that these ethnographic techniques from anthropology and sociology were highly germane to studying animals, there was a strong resistance to that in both of those disciplines for a long time, which has now practically flipped. I mean, you still find some of that resistance, but nowadays it's much more active interest. So I bring that up because since this book came out in the mid-1990s, this book itself is very interesting and groundbreaking, but talking about this book in terms of this larger dynamic, we kind of help us track how things have changed in terms of the approaches and investments since that time. And I'll be able to return to some of that as I talk more about the book, or as we talk in question and answer. So then fast forward a few years, around the turn of the millennium, when I was in graduate school in France, at that time, Bruno Latour, who was an anthropology professor at the École des Mines, the School of Mines at that time, told me about Vinciane Desprez's work that she had been doing with Arabian babblers. And it was interesting to me because it was clear that she was someone else who believed that the techniques of the social sciences could be used to study animals as well as humans and human-animal interactions. Brief chronology as things went on, then later on, a mutual friend of ours, Dominique Lestel, who teaches in cognitive science and philosophy at the École Normale Supérieure, introduced Vinciane and me. And then there's been a lot of discussions between all of us about this very issue, about how to use these methods and how to tweak these methods to best study animals and animal-human interactions. And then a few years ago, Vinciane asked me if I would translate this book. And she told me, as I mentioned in the introduction to the book, that the reason she asked me to translate this book is that she was fascinated by our research at the Center for Feline Studies on feline social interaction and human feline social interaction. So since she saw us as kindred spirits and saw a methodological resonance there, she asked me if I would be willing to translate this, which was her first book. She has a number of books that she's put out in the meantime, and I happily agreed because I thought it's a fantastic book, and I've been really very much influenced by her approaches and her writing overall. Now, one of the things she highlights in this book, I'll talk about kind of three main points that the book covers, but one of the things that drove her to write this book or to get involved in this book is, like I said, this issue of methods and trying to kind of break open the limitations that the disciplines had kept on their own methods or their own horizons. Another thing she's interested in, because this is also kind of comes out of the moment of anthropology and sociology of science in the mid-1990s. It's not a coincidence that Vinciane and Bruno Latour are close friends. One of the things she was interested in is how our beliefs and our desires, or in other words, what we would like to believe, can become translated into our research. And I'll talk in more specific terms about that, how that happens. Now, I should also say, because Vinciane's a very circumspect scholar, that when she first started to address these issues or think about it, she thought that there was going to be like a kind of a direct, like kind of old-fashioned social construction account that very directly explained how, you know, certain human ideologies or beliefs would be visited on how we saw the animal world. As she documents in this book, her view became much more complicated than that. And it's not, she moved beyond that model of a simple social constructionism. And the reason she moved beyond that is that she herself felt that the only way she could really do justice to what she wanted to study here with the Arabian babblers was to go to the field herself and to study the babblers herself in the field in the Negev desert in Israel. Now, the reason why she was drawn to study them, which I think is also one of the reasons why the biologist Amol Zahavi she worked with was drawn to study these birds, is that they're well known for dancing. They put on these elaborate group dances that happen in the twilight, like the early morning and at dusk. It's very peculiar because these are protracted, energy intensive, communal activities that the birds take part in. And the dancing, I mean, in addition to being kind of immediately fascinating when you see it, it raises a number of big questions. One of those big questions in biology, evolutionary point of view, is that the birds make themselves vulnerable by this dancing to predators, and they also expend a lot of energy. So it doesn't seem to be any straightforward reason why the bird should be dancing like that. As a matter of fact, it seems like it exposes them to risk. And then on the other hand, from a sociological or anthropological point of view, dancing is something that we historically have oftentimes treated as a human cultural phenomenon. And like I was saying, some of the disciplines resisted studying animals. Part of that resistance was this old-fashioned belief that we've now kind of surpassed, that there were things like language or dance or eating hot chili peppers and things like that, that only humans did. Now we know better, but we had to kind of cross through that accumulated set of prejudices about what animals are or what they could do. So like I said, Vinciane believed that she needed to go into the field herself. She had already done some ethological research. Ethology, for those of you who don't know, it's a fancy word that basically means the study of animal behavior. And I can say in the background here that kind of what has happened over the last decades is that different researchers have realized that that study of ethology, which used to be housed only in biology, and the study of ethnography, which used to be housed primarily in sociology and anthropology, those have crossed over, because the more we realize that there's an evolutionary continuity between humans and animals, and the more that we realize that these things that we used to think totally separated off humans from other animals, the more people started to realize that a lot of the observational techniques of ethology and ethnography were similar. And there's been this kind of work to articulate or bring together or cross-pollinate those approaches. And Vinciane had that feeling that she needed to go into the field. She had already done some ethological, biological observation on birds in Belgium, but she wanted to go see these birds that dance, the Arabian babblers, and she wanted to see how the human scientists were observing them and how it was that the human scientists were making sense of what they saw. The subtitle of this book is The Birth of an Ethological Theory. So in other words, how biological theories emerged from the kind of research that these scientists were doing. And like I said, she realized that there was no substitute for this direct observation, which is something that's also, I think, a shibboleth in anthropology and sociology. She realized that, of course, you have to go through the literature and read all the background literature, but there's no substitute for actually directly observing and seeing what you are. All right, so let me talk about, I guess my internet connection was unstable, but I think it's getting better. Let me talk about some of the reverberations of this book and of the research that it entails. Like I mentioned, Vinciane went to the field and she worked with a famous biologist who passed away a few years ago named Emot Zahavi, an Israeli biologist. And Emot Zahavi, I guess you could say, kind of set his own path. He did things his own way. One of the things that attracted Vinciane to working with him, and the kind of linchpin that she attributes as being the reason why he made such important discoveries, is that he took an anthropological approach to the birds rather than a biological approach. So in other words, he didn't see them as mechanisms. He didn't see them as simple behaviorist objects that were motivated only by food or that kind of thing. He saw them as complex social actors who had their own social trajectories, and that they weren't just marked by their species being, so to speak, by being Arabian babblers, that kind of set the stage for who they were, but in fact their lives were constituted by these complex social stories that Zahavi was trying to take account of. So in her view, his using those anthropological methods was the reason why he was able to upend biology. And quickly, what he did in biology that was significant, he's the one who's associated with this idea called the handicap principle, which is basically the idea, we kind of just described it about the dance. It's kind of the idea that in evolution, if you have something like a peacock tail, which is clearly an encumbrance for the peacock, right? All it does is make them more vulnerable to predators. So why would that emerge in evolution if all it does is make the peacock more vulnerable? And Zahavi came up with this explanation, the handicap principle, which in a nutshell basically says that animals demonstrate their fitness for survival or their strength by displaying these kind of traits. So peacocks having that elaborate tail that makes them slower, babblers dancing at a time that makes them vulnerable, that actually is a way by which they show their evolutionary fitness rather than incurring all these risks. Now, this was a very controversial idea in biology, and some of you probably know the well-known biologist, ethologist Richard Dawkins, who was for a time kind of the dean, so to speak, of the ethologists at Oxford. Sorry, he was extremely hostile to this idea that Zahavi expressed. As a matter of fact, he really ridiculed it and he made fun of Zahavi and said it was nonsense. But as time went on, Dawkins was forced to admit that the handicap principle actually seemed to be correct. So in the second edition of his famous book, Selfish Gene, he had to admit that in fact Zahavi was correct and he was onto something, and that even though we might know the underlying mechanisms of evolution, we don't always recognize the complexity of the paths that it takes. And the Arabian babblers are one animal among many who help us to flesh that out or to see that. Now, let me just say also parenthetically that Vinciane also attributes Zahavi's location in Israel and in the Negev to him coming up with these theories. She said if Zahavi had worked at Oxford, he probably never would have come up with such unorthodox theories that happened to be correct, that happened to change the course of the discipline. So there was something about being there, and certainly about studying these particular animals, that gave rise to those discoveries. The last thing I'll say here, and something that she covers beautifully in the book, is that looking at the babblers and looking at these discussions comes back to some issues in political economy that we deal with routinely in anthropology and sociology, and that are transposed back and forth between the human world and the animal world. Some of you probably know the biologist E.O. Wilson from Harvard. One of his students is the radiocaster for the Freakonomics program on NPR. And that guy has commented that there are no two disciplines that have a closer bond than economics and biology. And I'll show you how this works. What Vinciane fleshes out in the book is that Darwin, we all know Darwin is the kind of father of evolution, and Darwin obviously did groundbreaking, important work, but Darwin himself was English and was born and raised and developed his theories, even though he did a voyage around the world on the Beagle and took all these notes. A lot of his ideas were expressed and written in the context of this colonial, imperial England, Britain of the 19th century. And one of those ideas is the idea of scarcity, the idea that there's not enough in nature for animals to be able to survive, so therefore they're always in conflict with one another. Vinciane looks at the counterexample of the Russian anarchist Pierre Alexander Kropotkin, who didn't grow up in England and didn't study animals in England, which is of course an island with a limited territory and all that, but who was Russian and who did his field work in Siberia. And Kropotkin had kind of the opposite underlying presumption that there is plenty of resources available for animals to survive, and that they incorporate various kind of practices to cooperate rather than kill each other off if there's a scarcity of resources. This is called mutual aid, and there's a strain of it not only in ethology and biology, but also especially in politics and anarchism, this notion of mutual aid. So by looking at the cooperative, communal, social practices of the babblers and highlighting this kind of these two pillars kind of Darwin and Kropotkin, two opposite kind of trajectories of naturalism or of evolution, she's able to talk about this political economic difference between scarcity and mutual aid, and see how those discourses play out not only in our ideas about human society, but our ideas about animal society. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. So at this point, we're going to be open for Q&A. So if you have a question, please raise your virtual hand and I will just take you in the order in which you come up. While you're formulating your questions, I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and pose a question to each of Ismail and Jeff. So I'll give you both questions at the same time, and then I'll just turn it over to you to respond in turn. So Ismail, in the last 3 chapters of your book in particular, you explore how labor camps are deeply ambiguous and contradictory sites. They're where Puerto Rican laborers try to maintain their hopes and dreams, but also where they experience despair. There are total institutions organized to subdue and allow surveillance of workers, but also points of intervention by various state bodies, and where the seeds of coordinated resistance germinate, expressed, for example, in the displays and tensions in North Collins. Such ambiguous, contradictory spaces are often where change can occur. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about how they produced not just despair, but the possibility of resistance, both individual and collective. And as an extension of that question, if colonialism produces certain kinds of subjects, the camps being one means of production, how does that production and the introduction of those subjects into the heart of empire impact empire itself? Now, turning to Jeff, there's a point of contact, I think, between the work of Desprez's research and your own a work of translation that I'd like you to just invite you to comment on. So that is, translation concerns, in my view, more than, as it were, finding English equivalents for French phrases, more than just linguistic fluency. It requires an openness to otherness as well, but an openness that's informed by expertise. So it seems to me that the cultivation of expertise to allow oneself to become attuned to the other is also a feature of both Desprez and Zahavi's work, let's call it ethnographic. And so I was hoping that you could respond to this idea that cultivation of expertise for receptiveness to otherness characterizes both the work that you translate and the work of translation. Okay, so now, please, I will stop talking and turn it over to you.
Would you like to go, Ismail?
Okay, I mean, those are very, very good and deep questions. So let me see. You tell me if I answered them or not. So in terms of the possibilities of resistance, when I was conducting the research, it was very obvious and visible when I will ask them, the workers, about their experiences, and they will say that this is like living in a prison, right? When they talk about living in the labor camps. But this wasn't limited to the workers themselves. You know, I will find documents, newspaper clippings from the 1940s, talking about the same thing. You know, the feeling of workers like living in prison-like conditions. Other workers at the beginning would, you know, they were being told that they couldn't leave the camps. So they thought that, you know, they were not free. But at the same time, as you know, as some of them remain in the camps, others will disappear, right? They will arrive under the contracts, work for certain days. They didn't like the work, they didn't like the treatment from the farmer, and then they will disappear, usually during the night. So, I mean, the labor camp can be a total institution in the way that those that are subject to live in the camps have to supposedly been disciplined, and many are disciplined by the constant regulation of their times, their routines of the labor camp. But that doesn't impede, right, that people will break the rules often during during work and in the labor camps. And this is not just a matter of social relations of power, right? It's also about how these migrants are trying to make sense of the world around them, especially a new world, right? A world that is like even the government of Puerto Rico says in the documents in the 1950s, is an ethnological alien to the workers, right? A world where there's a new language, other cultural practices, other people, other types of racial relations. So at the same time that this is the labor camps and this experience is very alienating for the workers, it also gives them possibilities to migrate to other places after the harvest, to go to the small towns to buy food and to for entertainment, and start experience, right, the United States, or even working with other workers that were African Americans or even whites from the United States. In terms of how this transformed empire, I think there's multiple layers, right? How this transformed empire. In one way, I mean, this is, like I mentioned, this program and this migration established many of the Puerto Rican communities that are in the Northeast, especially in small places like in Vineland, Southern New Jersey, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that probably has more Puerto Ricans than Amish. And if they are not more Puerto Ricans than Amish, Puerto Ricans are a sizable population there, but they are invisible, right? In Rochester, Pennsylvania, Buffalo, Springfield, Massachusetts, many towns also in the Midwest, Cleveland, Ohio, are the products of this migration. It transforms the relationship, the flow of migration between the United States and Puerto Rico in terms of building an infrastructure of migration that is what it made possible, right? In 2017, when Hurricane Maria happened, that more than 200,000 Puerto Ricans moved temporarily to the United States when the islands were suffering the aftermath of the hurricanes. Also, in terms of how Puerto Ricans see themselves as part of the United States as a nation state, right? You have this migration was the background to solidify this sense of Puerto Ricans being part of the United States in the sense of accommodating, adapting to this relationship, this colonial relationship, but also in terms of opposing politically this colonial relation with the United States, and many other things that I haven't mentioned, but I want Jeffrey to be able to talk to. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Ismael. Well, first of all, let me just say thank you, Don. That's a fantastic question, and I really appreciate it because oftentimes translation gets short shrift, or translation kind of gets left to the wayside or unacknowledged. So it's very nice to be able to highlight the practice of translation. And I think that's a really good points about expertise and about open and receptiveness to others. Let me tell two origin stories that kind of approach or deal with my approach to translation and the expertise and the receptiveness to others. A lot of you already know that my undergraduate studies were in Georgetown School of Foreign Service, which is a diplomacy school. And we had to do a diplomatic language proficiency there, which, that was a nice thing. But perhaps more important than that is the emphasis on diplomacy. And diplomacy, like anthropology, like sociology, is one of those fields that is predicated upon receptiveness to others. You can't really get anywhere in any of these fields without some receptiveness to others, right? There has dialogue, like observing, frankly, not imposing your own beliefs. All those kind of things are very, very important. I should say parenthetically here that in the meantime, since getting to know Vinciane, I've realized that she has a category in her research, it's not in this book, but in other ones, of animal diplomacy, where she says if we are treating animals as interlocutors, reasoned interlocutors, then we should have a practice of diplomacy that also applies to animals. And I think that's actually beginning to emerge in diplomacy itself, but it's something I'd be interested to pursue more in the future. So last thing about that, one of the concentrations I followed when I was there in the School of Foreign Service was Science and Technology and International Affairs. And my kind of sub-concentration was in biology. So when I came to be doing this work later on, I was really thankful that I had at least some of that grounding in biology then. Okay, next part of the origin story. Also, many of you know that a mentor of mine once I came to New York was Joan Stambaugh, a philosopher who had translated Martin Heidegger's Being and Time. And she was like Emot Zahavi, someone who very much did her own thing, a very serious researcher, but someone who did things according to how she thought they should be approached. And it was interesting because even though she translated Being in Time, which, you know, one of the most prominent works of philosophy of the 20th century, she always said philosophy is a thankless task because she said, if it seems smooth, then no one acknowledges it, and they don't even look the name of the translator. But if they have something they're angry about, then they'll track you down and then they'll denounce you. And I can remember that because she had actually translated Being in Time in 1968, but it didn't get released until the 90s. And there was a chorus of denunciations, mostly from male scholars. Why do we need this and that, blah, blah, blah. But then a kind of a counterpoint emerged from more reasonable counterpoint of other scholars saying this translation is important and should now be the standard, not only because she knew Martin Heidegger and she was in Freiburg for 8 years working with him, but because she herself is a philosopher. So she has the expertise necessary to make a philosophical translation of a philosophical work. The other translators, Macquarie and Robson, are not philosophers. So anyway, that speaks to this issue of expertise and also the short shrift of that translation often gets. Fast forward a little bit again, when I made reference to being in grad school in France, my advisor in France, Michel Thibon-Cornillot, was someone who had been a biological engineer at Institut Pasteur, and then he switched to become an anthropologist of technology. So once again, having some of that, limited grounding or dialogue with him in biology was a huge help when I came to do this work. That being said, there was still a lot of work to like come up to speed on the expertise. French is my third language. Italian's my second language. So I could have like a kind of conversational or even like classroom French, but this kind of technical biological vocabulary is much different. So there was definitely a learning curve, and there was definitely a need to kind of go back to the drawing board on that, or to look at the translations of Darwin and Dawkins and see how they had been rendered in French, and therefore what the understanding was of like what people were talking about in French. So anyway, I think you're right if diplomacy and anthropology and sociology require this receptiveness to others, translation by all means does also, because you first of all got to be open to the thought and work of someone else, and you've got to be open enough or caring enough that you will spend the time and effort to transmute it into English. But you've also got to try to sometimes they believe that translation is like a mathematical algorithm, and I guess we do have Google Translate nowadays and all that, but we also know that you get these fantastic nonsense sometimes from that. But it's not really a mathematical enterprise, right? It's something, so in translation, you've got to try to get the idea of the person you're translating, but it can't, if you just do it literally, it's nonsense. So it's got to be that idea, but it's also got to be transposed. So it's got to be like a continuous receptiveness to otherness. And I appreciate your highlighting that, because like I said, oftentimes it gets ignored or overlooked. So thank you.
Thank you both very much. So those are terrific answers. So now I'll open the floor to any other questions. Ananya, please. Unmute.
Okay,
There.
sorry. So my question is, I was thinking this just as we were kind of organizing this event. I get a lot of, sorry, I've got a fan here in the background. I get a lot of questions from students often about why we have this foreign language requirement in this major. And for the undergrads here in particular, it strikes me, almost everyone in our department, almost all of us do cross-regional or multicultural or multi-language research to some extent. And I wonder if the two of you could comment on sort of what role, it certainly is a critical or pivotal, obvious or not obvious role in both your work. I wonder if you could comment on just what role your own facility in multiple languages has for your research, and also if there are any pitfalls, any it's more than just being conversant in multiple languages. So someone else has something to say here, so I'll mute myself again. But I think you understand what I'm asking.
Jeffrey, do you want to start?
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. One thing I would say is one time, one of my language teachers long time ago told me that you don't really learn grammar until you learn at least a second language. And at first I didn't know what they meant, but then I realized that's true. Like, my own experience, like in middle school, high school or whatever, and you're learning English grammar and you learn some about English grammar, but you don't really learn the function or the fine points of grammar until you're thinking about how it's either the same or different across different languages. So I think that, and not to mention the fact that just your view of social reality, of reality itself, is mediated through language, right? So if you can see how that happens differently through different languages, it can, unhinge or change your whole viewpoint of the, reality itself and scholarship. So I think it's from a matter of perspective. It gives you just different perspectives that can be very helpful, especially along the lines of receptiveness to others, like you're saying. Now, I partly because of that diplomacy background I was talking about, I felt also there's kind of a duty that also Joan I was talking about felt that, there's certain scholarship that takes place in these linguistic silos. Like I came to realize that these three people, Vincent, Dominique, who I referred to, and this other guy, Roberto, were all doing this work on animals that was going on for decades. And no one knew about it in the English Anglophone world because it hadn't really been translated so much. But they were doing stuff that was like fundamental, and it was like way beyond what was going on in the Anglophone English speaking scholarship. So I felt if I can do something, my small part to try to, carry some of that over to join those dialogues, then I was interested in doing that, very interested in doing that, facilitating that. In terms of the pitfalls, sometimes there is a pitfall. There are different assumptions or different kind of shibboleths, I guess, or like taken for granted facts, I guess, in different linguistic communities or in different linguistic scholarly communities. So the way some of these things are approached in France is different than the way it's approached in Anglophone world, and for that matter, it's different in US versus England versus Australia and that kind of thing. But anyway, the more you attend to translation or multiple languages, you get a sense of that and you can work with that.
In my case, well, one advantage is that because I come from Puerto Rico, not only I'm Puerto Rican, but I'm a Puerto Rican from the highlands of Puerto Rico, where most of this migration occurred, right? And I have relatives that migrated as part of this migration of farm workers. And actually, the brother of my paternal grandmother, he migrated in the 1950s as a farm worker and lived in Lancaster, Pennsylvania for most of his life. So because I have this background and I am studying these workers, it's easy for me. It's not just about speaking Spanish, but speaking the same slang, right? The same particularities, words, accent, pronunciations that they speak. So it's easy for me to have a conversation with them and to establish this rapport that you need to establish with the people that you are interviewing and talking to, right? In terms of the farmers, that's my weakness, right? It's more difficult for me to establish a relationship with a farmer than a worker. In addition to the issue of languages, that I can, my work is actually it makes a break with the previous studies of Puerto Rican farm workers that were Puerto Rican centric in the sense that they only saw the effects of this in Puerto Rico and not in the United States. So I am going beyond this Puerto Rico versus the United States and trying to see the flow, right? Although I'm not studying return migration, I'm looking at, you know, the policies of the government of Puerto Rico, but also the policies of the government of the United States. And that's why I argue that you have to look at colonialism rather transnationalism. But to do what I'm doing here is also about language, right? Because many studies that are about empire in Puerto Rico, they are mostly have been written by English dominant people that lack knowledge of Spanish. And then you have, right, studies of Puerto Rican history and Puerto Rican anthropology without having this connection to the literature in the United States. So English allows me to look at the experiences of other guest workers and migrant farm workers in the United States, like the Mexican Bracero program, but also in, you know, in the case of Mexico, the case of British West Indian migrants, even Canadian migrant farm workers from Newfoundland. And you know, being bilingual in that sense, you know, it gives me, I think it makes more wider my study. I'm able to capture more processes and development in this history than just being monolingual. Thank you.
So there are a couple of questions that Sadia Tour has placed in the chat. I'll just read them out. I think they're linked to one another. So I'll just read them out continuously, and then you can respond to them as you like. So she says, I think students might benefit from understanding how both of you came even to decide to be social scientists. What did you do in undergrad, and how did that lead you to where you are now? Jeff has addressed it more, but maybe Ismail can talk about his journey. And then the second part was actually, I guess it was a response to your ways of addressing language. She says, I think you can say the same thing about culture. It's often only when we experience another culture that we come to question the things we take for granted or don't question about our own. So maybe Ismail, you can start off by talking about what led you to becoming a social scientist and anthropologist, and then you can both respond to the second part as you like.
My story is very long because I wanted to be an anthropologist when I was 15 years old, which is something out of the ordinary. But before that, like I really liked, I remember like in elementary school liking reading about history, about history of the Americas, like the myth of origins, for example, of the Inca Empire. I still remember that. And I was really also interested in archaeology, indigenous people in the Americas. And this has to do with the way that the government of Puerto Rico was promoting this view of Puerto Rican national identity, right? That the Puerto Ricans, one of the heritage of Puerto Ricans is the indigenous peoples from the Americas. So that was that exoticism, something that now as an anthropologist I reject. It was what it brought me to anthropology. And like I was reading in this magazine that it was like a National Geographic, it was called Geomundo. I was reading about this indigenous group in the Amazon and how anthropologists were studying them. And I said, that's what I want to do. And I started looking about anthropology. But when I went to the university, I already knew that I wanted to study anthropology. Maybe I thought that I was gonna work in a museum or something like that, not to become a professor. But then I became, I began to learn about anthropological theory, about social science theory, and I began to reject, right, many of that exotic gaze that we are taught in popular, in general, in popular culture. And but you know, my general social science electives were in anthropology, and I did a minor in history. And so my professors also, my main mentor, emphasized this combination of history and anthropology, and some of what I was taught by him is still I practice, even though when he died like 10 years ago, he was doing something completely different from what he taught me. I continue the path that I follow him, but he moved to other pastures, like we say. And so in terms of culture, I guess this perspective, right, that I have as a Puerto Rican, as a Puerto Rican migrant in the United States, right, and my experiences of not being considered a U.S. citizen, of being asked about if I have papers or not. And for example, I mentioned I have a colleague at CSI. I told him once that, you know, the problem is that, you know, they want to deport you and they will deport you. In my case is that they want to deport me and they cannot deport me. So in my book is actually a reflection of that interaction that I had with that CSI professor. Thank you. Thank you.
Super. Jeff?
That's a great point, Sadia. And I can take an example that Vinciane gives in her book about, I guess we might say, cultures of research, where once again, she talks about the particular situation of the study center in the desert for studying the Arabian babblers, which is like off in the boonies, you know, in the desert, requires going there, requires staying there. And she, since she was there for a long time, she tracks the different approaches the different researchers took. And she makes a delineation between Zahavi's approach, which was a posteriori, which means basically, I mean, it's like ethnography. He went and he hung out with the birds. He hung out with the birds for a long time. And then he started to see eventually what the birds were showing him, according to his reckoning of the process. But he didn't go with a particular research question. He went for a long time to see what they were doing. Therefore, he says he noticed these things that he never would have seen because it would have been precluded by his disciplinary blinders. On the other hand, there were these other researchers coming to his field station from Oxford. And they, on the one hand, had what she calls a priori research framework, where they had very particular and reductive research questions that they were looking for. So that means that they're either trying to shoehorn everything that they see into that question, and or they're missing all kind of other things because they're not paying attention to those. Part and parcel of that, they were also extremely wedded to game theory of evolution and computer simulations. So it meant that they were, even before observing the animals in some cases, they would run these simulations, computer programs of game theory of evolution, and then come and say, no, the birds can't do that because the model says they won't do that. Whereas Zahavi said, I don't care what the birds do is what's important to me. I don't really care about the computer. And so that kind of dramatically illustrated different cultures of research, where Zahavi was this, more anthropological hangout, see what you see, and also long-term serious observation that you have to take in over time, rather than kind of piecemeal, segmented, very specific research questions. And then especially all this other stuff about the computer simulation, though that illustrated, one cultural difference between those camps that made real differences in terms of the type of research that they produced.
Super. Okay. Jay has a question. Please, Jay, go ahead. Jay, I think you're still muted.
Yeah, thanks, Don. I'm double tasking here from several meetings, so bear with me. First of all, I'd like to congratulate both authors for their works. Tip my hat. But as a son of a muck farmer from upstate New York, who worked shoulder to shoulder with farm workers from Puerto Rico in the 1970s and early 1980s, before I went up to New Orleans, I'm especially appreciative of Professor Garcia Colon's work, a lot of hard work in gathering this important study. So my comment are twofold. One is, of course, from coming from Central New York, the first thing I went when I got the book was to go to the index and look to anything around Fulton and Oswego. And I did find it was more a focus on Western New York and Southern New Jersey, if I'm correct. Hopefully there will be another volume on Central New York. But I did see, which really caught my eye, reference to a job action, direct action by farm workers in a Oswego farm. And then there was some intervention from the Puerto Rican government to kind of cool things out, it seemed like, and they got some concession. But I was just curious where that, because I couldn't find the source and who was the farm. I'm thinking Santoro or Ferlito, but I don't know if you remember that. The other part is, I think it's really important what I gathered. I've just gone through it really quickly. I hope to have a deeper read maybe over the summer. But what I took away as a central argument is that the undocumented status is desired by the employers because the workers are weaker, and so Puerto Rican workers have become less desirable than the undocumented. And I think that's an important lesson for the immigrant rights movement, which kind of on the liberal end is talked about, well, these people take work because that no one else will do. The issue is the differential power status and the need for the worker movement to fight for equal rights for all, to eliminate the two-tier divide, to strengthen the labor movement, be it in agriculture or other areas. So I think that's a really important contribution that I gathered from your work. So I'll shut up, listen, and then have to get back to another meeting.
So Jay, I on purpose I have to leave things ambiguous because I don't want people to read the book and go to the places, right? so in some, and because of IRB regulations, we are not supposed to reveal, right? Many of the names of the people involved in some of the descriptions that I mentioned and the places that I mentioned. So that's that's my answer to the first part of your question. The second part of your question is, yes, I mean, undocumented workers and guest workers are the perfect workers for agriculture according to farmers because they can easily exploit them. They can take advantage of the fear of deportation to threaten the workers. I mean, that's the main reason. So in this case, in what I talk about in my book is that Puerto Rican workers are imperfect, right? Workers for this agrarian labor regime because they have rights and they can contest those rights. And that's why most of the farmers don't like to hire Puerto Rican workers. And that's why to the present time, right, until 2018, I have heard of cases of farmers hiring Puerto Ricans, firing Puerto Ricans and hiring undocumented workers. There are still farmers that, you know, they want to do things by the book like anybody else, right? And they will hire, and that's why they still hire Puerto Rican workers. But other farmers don't, you know, they don't really care. They just care about a source of labor that they can pull workers. They don't really care if they are documented or undocumented. And the fact is that many of these communities vote for elected officials that oppose immigration reform and giving legal papers to undocumented workers. Right? So it's beneficial to keep them as undocumented workers. Thank you.
I don't see any other hands up just right at the moment. So
Just thought of a tidbit. Can I throw in?
please.
And it has to do with this category. I'm really glad you introduced of receptivity to others and otherness. When Desprez encapsulates part of what she thinks was so important about Zahavi's method, not only it was a posteriori, open-ended, seeing what he saw, but also she says that what that resulted in was that he started to see difference where other observers had typically seen sameness. And that, I think, is a technique of receptivity to otherness.
Yeah,
So in
that's
other words-
interesting. So there's a certain kind of this is partly responding also to what Barbara Katz-Rothman has posted, that there's a certain answerability to what you actually find in the field rather than an answerability to the answer that you formulated before you've even started to investigate.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So the thing that I wanted to ask both of you while we're waiting for another question to appear has to do with marginality. So what I'm suggesting here is not something that romanticizes marginality. Marginality is in the one case, it's the site of your exploitation. It's the site of what makes you vulnerable to abuse. In the other case, marginality for, say, Zahavi is how you don't get published by the Oxford group of biologists, how you get maligned and set aside by them. But it also seems to me that in both of your works, what you point to is a potential in the margins, that the margins have the potential for unpredictability and therefore the possibility of change that simply is not going to come from something like the center or the metropole, call it what you will. So I wondered if you would each be willing to comment on that, on the potential that is perhaps latent in marginality. Or perhaps I'm inviting each of you to write another entire book. I'm not sure if that's a manageable question.
I don't know if Jeffrey wants to.
I can try, unless you have something right away.
No, I don't. I mean, I can mention this. Okay. So, in terms of marginality, and I'm actually thinking about Jeffrey's work, right? The issue that Darwin came from this Western European society to try to go, and he went to the Galapagos to try to understand how evolution happens. But in modern Western society, there's especially in the early 19th century, that there were these notions of individuality, right? Of Hobbesian ideas of violence, right? That I think were really key to come up with this survival of the fittest notion. You know, when I think about this issue of, for example, the survival of the fittest versus mutual aid, in terms of the farm workers, I am thinking about the complexity, right, of something that of a world that I'm trying to understand. In my case, I believe it's a social reality, right? For me, the world is real, right? And the concepts that we create are essential to be able to grasp that world and understand that world. And it's not, for me, it's not simple as saying, right, that these farm workers have been oppressed by the farmers. These farm workers have agency. It wasn't just that the government of Puerto Rico promoted their migration, is that the government of Puerto Rico was promoting their migration, but they were also deciding to migrate, because I have many extended family members that migrated to the United States, but my immediate family didn't migrate during this time that I am studying. So it's not a, the analysis that just look at extreme pole of the situation are I think are very problematic in the social sciences. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Great, please, yeah.
Thank you, Ismail, and thank you, Don. Another really good question and really good reflections, Ismail. As a social scientist, I immediately think of Marx and standpoint theory and Du Bois and double consciousness and these kind of epistemological and ontological aspects about the difficulty, but the clarity of the margins in a way, and those kind of things. And I immediately thought of Zahavi when you brought up marginality, and it's true that it interfered with his ability to get published in the kind of mainline arbiters of the discipline, and he didn't get a Nobel Prize. I mean, he's someone who certainly could have been, maybe if he lived longer or something like that. But that's one marker of the marginality. And on the other hand, one thing that she highlights that I kind of like about him is that he was so much dedicated to this a posteriori method and just dealing with what he saw the birds doing, that, as she puts it, he didn't play the game. He didn't play the scientific game. So, I mean, he certainly went to conferences and did publications and all that, but he really, didn't give a shit about the reviews or if something struck him as correct, he wasn't going to be bothered because it went against the disciplinary convention or something like that, So, and like she says, he probably would have had more well, it's funny to say because he's well known and he has his name, attached to this theory, but he probably would have had more ostensible institutional success had he taken care to demarginalize himself a little bit and play the game. In terms of the kind of its strategic advantages of the margins, to think about it in terms of the trajectory of this research we were talking about. Like I said, when I first started doing this and when Vinciane was writing this book, people thought it was crazy to treat animal societies as like a legit, of course, biologists were doing animal behavior. They weren't really doing animal societies per se at the time, but people thought it was, totally wacky in the social science disciplines and stuff. Psychology, of course, comparative psychology, but that was different. People thought it was that people were really, really invested in that anthropocentric divide. So it was very marginalizing to say, I'm studying animals as social actors. I'm studying social processes among animals. That was highly marginalizing. It didn't seem like political economy. It didn't seem like one of the main, the kind of like main lines of the discipline. But as far as I was concerned, that also gave a certain freedom, right? Because there was no script. There was no set down disciplinary standard that says you must do this, because if people were rejecting it, by definition, you had to invent the method yourself, which is part of the reason why Vinciane and others ended up to be so influential for me, that they were doing the same thing, that they were trying to do that same work, that like methodological conceptual work, just like you were saying, Ismail, the concepts have a real role in terms of what we see and then what we can change, you know, what, that marginality can somehow fuel that necessity of developing those trajectories or methods or concepts, I guess.
Excellent, thank you. So at this point, let me ask, are there any other lingering questions out there that you want to pose before we call it a day? Are there any last things that either of you, Ismail or Jeff, would like to say before we shut down?
Could I just say one thing? Just a reminder about the EMP ID. If you want clue credit and you haven't already put your EMP ID in the chat box, please do so now. Thank you.
In that case, let me renew my invitation. Are there any last statements from either of Ismail or Jeff? Or shall I wrap it up?
I just want to thank you for being the host of this panel, and to Anania, Jeremiah, and others for organizing the event. And hopefully we can have something, at least to do something like this, like every semester with full-time and part-time professors in the department.
Agreed.
And thank you to everyone. And thank you, Ismail, for this great work. And thank you for bringing around again to Kropotkin and Darwin.
Yes, man. Yeah, I think that those is very important, that point. And actually, when I teach in my classes, I mentioned that.
And thanks to Don, thanks to our speakers. This really was such a great event, and Don put a lot of work into this. I appreciate everyone's participation.
Thank you.
Well, it's been an absolute delight for me, and thank everyone. I would like to thank everyone for coming and attending, and for the great questions that we've had. And I wish you all a brilliant afternoon.